So this is what we're reading from The Sound Between the Notes by Barbara Linn Probst. And let me read you the back cover copy, and then I will go straight into chapter 1. What if someone offered you a chance to have the very thing you thought you'd renounce forever? Susanna understands that restoring her lost magic at the keyboard and maybe, just maybe, vaulting into that elite tier of chosen musicians will have a price. Everything does. But she never expected the price to be so high. Susanna hasn't thought about her birth family in years until she learns that she has a progressive hereditary disease that's making her fingers cramp and curl, a curse waiting in her genes, legacy of a family that gave her little else. She's catapulted back to memories she hasn't been able to purge and forward to the country and western sister she's never known. And this is chapter 1 of The Sound Between the Notes by Barbara Linn Probst. Part 1, The Audition. Do not take up music unless you would rather die than not do so. Nadia Boulanger, composer, conductor, and teacher. Susanna looked at her watch. 7 minutes to go. Really, there was no reason to be so nervous. She'd done this plenty of times over the years. It was like pulling on a pair of familiar boots or diving into a pool. Muscle memory, they called it. It had been a long time since she'd sat like this, waiting on a folding chair for someone to open a studio door and beckon her inside. But her body remembered. And her emotions, they definitely remembered. 15 years, Susanna thought, since she'd auditioned for something this important. But the music world didn't change, even if the musician had. Auditions were rituals, stylized to maximize their gravity. She'd been to enough before she walked away to know what was on the other side of that studio door. A big, windowless room where a Steinway grand piano would greet her, its lid raised like an ebony sail. A panel of judges with their clipboards and cool, professional smiles. A clock on the wall. Only the details varied. The colour of the judge's clothing, the piece she had picked to play. 15 years was a long time. So was 7 minutes. She raised her eyes to scan the hallway. A styrofoam cup, abandoned next to a wastebasket, cast a shadow like a misshapen halo on the blackened planks of the hardwood floor. She couldn't help wincing. What pianist would bring coffee to an audition? You needed to be quiet inside, not revved up. She was already revved up enough with an excitement bordering on panic. An elevator pinged in the distance. There was the clang of a radiator, and then the hallway was silent. She looked at her hands again, the ridge of her knuckles, the thin gold band, the blue veins just below the surface, like a road to somewhere. Or nowhere. That was always a possibility. Vera had been confident that the solo was hers if she wanted it, but Vera was like that, arrogant and imperious. Susanna knew, and she knew Vera did too, that there weren't any guarantees in the music world, no matter who you were or what famous teacher had recommended you. Susanna Lewis? A tall man with a neatly trimmed beard opened the door and squinted at her over the top of his glasses. She sprang to her feet. Yes, here! Her voice caught, eager and high-pitched. Good Lord, she sounded like a schoolgirl instead of a woman nearing 40. You're on in 5 minutes, he told her. Yes, thank you. The man gave a quick nod and slipped inside the studio, pulling the door shut behind him. Susanna dropped back into the chair. 5 minutes to relax, clear her mind, let the music find its way into her hands. She squared her feet, heels aligned with the edge of the floorboard, and tried to ignore the sounds filtering through the oak door. Arpeggios and chromatic seventh, Rachmaninoff, that showy part of the Allegro agitato, not her style. Even though they had been given strict instructions to avoid overlapping, she had arrived early, and glimpsed the young man who was auditioning before her. His youth had shocked and dismayed her. She bit her lip, willing herself not to think about the young man or when she'd been or what she'd been like at that age, or how long it had really been since she'd offered her music and herself to a panel of strangers. She couldn't help wondering what Aaron would think if he knew what she was up to. There were no secrets in their marriage, yet she hadn't dared to tell him about the audition. If she didn't get picked, it wouldn't matter. And if she did, well, she'd deal with that later. If. So much weight and yearning in those two letters, that tiny syllable. The elevator pinged again. Susanna looked at her watch. 4 minutes to go. She wiped her palms along the side of her skirt. Then she realized that the hallway was silent. No more Rachmaninoff coming from the other side of the oak door. Had the other pianist finished early? The silence could only mean one thing. He'd been dismissed. Her pulse shot skyward. The committee was only listening to 3 people, 4 at most. That was what Vera had told her. They had to make it look like an actual selection based on merit, not convenience driven by desperation. 3 or 4 pianists, each willing to step in and replace the Chilean virtuoso who'd been whisked off to rehab. And she was one of them, thanks to Vera, the renowned piano teacher who had shocked the music world by leaving the concert circuit at the height of her fame and devoting herself to her pupils. Susanna had become one of those pupils when her feet could barely reach the pedals. She had told herself, getting dressed and heading into Manhattan, that this was simply a job, a nice return to the professional stage after 15 years of safe little programs at churches and schools. But there was something else, and that something else was the reason her heart was beating such a crazy staccato. The rapture. She'd lost it somewhere between teaching and giving workshops and making sure that everyone's life was running smoothly. It wasn't Aaron's fault, maybe not even her own, but the magic was gone and she wanted it back. She had known and not known, avoiding what she knew, until she sat down at the piano right after Vera's call to run through what she thought of as her reliable repertoire. Late Brahms, those show-stopping Chopin mazurkas, the pathétique, like flipping through a wardrobe of familiar clothes in case she decided to audition, as Vera insisted, and needed something to wear. She was halfway through Brahms's Opus 118 when a strange sensation made her stop in the middle of a measure. I'm not here. I'm not hearing the music. Here. They were the same thing, listening and knowing she existed. They had always been the same, their union so intrinsic to who she was that she'd never question it, until suddenly its absence assaulted her. The door swung open. We're ready for you. Susanna rose, more slowly this time, and followed the bearded man into the studio. The first thing she saw was the Steinway, a concert grand, splinters of light glinting on the mahogany surface. There was no sign of the young man. She noticed a door on the far wall, below a red exit sign. He must have left that way. Mrs. Lewis, or is it Ms. Lewis? A woman held a notebook in one hand, a sharpened pencil in the other. Red hair was heaped on her head. A necklace of big amber beads, roped twice, dropped to her waist in descending arcs. Libby Kaufmann, the organizer and publicist. Not a musician, but this wasn't a piano competition. It was a fundraising gala, and Libby was in charge. Next to Libby was an older woman with short grey hair. On her other side, a man in a blue turtleneck uncapped a water bottle. Miss Lewis, Susanna said. The person facing the trio of judges was someone who had existed long before she became Mrs. Lewis, someone who could exist again. I have you down for a Schubert sonata, Libby said, turning a page in her notebook. D960. Is that still correct? Yes, that's right. Susanna took the book of sonatas from her bag. Here, I've got the score. Did you want to follow along? She didn't know if Libby could read music, but she extended the book anyway. Not especially. You keep it. Lily closed the notebook. Do you need to warm up? Susanna met her eyes. For a wild instant, everything rose up in her. The hunger, the longing, then the doubt and the fear. Libby dipped her head, as if she'd seen. Just for a minute. She walked to the piano, the book of sonatas under her arm. Every piano was different, the touch, the response, the feel of the keys. She flexed the pedal, tried a few arpeggios and chords. Yes, good. The keys had a nice weight, a warmth to the tones. Then she opened the book and creased the page with her thumb. She didn't really need it. She'd memorized the piece long ago, yet it felt good to see the notes, like a gathering of old friends. If this had been a competition, she would probably have chosen one of those virtuoso pieces, like the Rachmaninoff, a Chopin etude, maybe, or La Campanella. Everyone played Liszt at the big competitions. But this wasn't a competition, and she didn't want to do that. She wanted to play a piece she loved. Schubert's B-flat major sonata, his final sonata, full of majesty and radiance and the exquisite longing of a man knowing he was about to die. Each person was supposed to play for 12 minutes, no longer. That's what Vera had explained. But Susanna couldn't do that to the B-flat major sonata. It would mean stopping right in the middle of the first movement. Maybe she should have chosen another piece, one that fit into the time she was allowed, but she decided no. Let them hear the piece she intended to play at the concert. Vera had agreed. Susanna looked at the three people sitting across from her, pencils poised, ready to note her mistakes. Then she thought of Schubert, dying at 31, ugly, isolated, in pain, pouring all of his yearning and ecstasy into the music. No one had the right to play his sonata without the same commitment, the same passion. She centered herself on the padded bench and readied her hands for the opening theme, the glorious B-flat and the steps up to D, stately and inevitable, and then the C octaves that weren't repetitions at all, but a widening, a preparation for the slow return. Her long, spidery fingers had always made it easy to play chord after chord, octave after octave, with a purity that lifted the melody right off the keys. For that clean, true sound, the hand had to be loose, free, the little finger landing just so on the top notes. It wasn't something she thought about, any more than she thought about how to breathe. Until now, when the finger didn't land and didn't sing. And there we go. That was part of chapter 1 of The Sound Between the Notes by Barbara Linn Probst. I hope you enjoyed that. Quite intense. What is going to happen now? What on earth is going to happen? Will she be able to play? I've got my papers all in a mess. Will she be able to play? Will she not? What is going to happen to Susanna? Is she going to get that job? Is she not? And what is she going to find out about her family? I'm not going to tell you.